And now for an inside look at college sports with the men in the know, JC and Morgan. Here's Mike Morgan and JC Shurburtt.
JC and Morgan podcast on with you today after a second week of college football. Didn't quite have the drama and the big matchups as the first week, but certainly was notable. I think, you kind of look at some of the games and some of them are head scratchers. Some of them had unbelievable finishes. Some of them featured teams getting up off the mat. Some featured teams laying an egg, for lack of a better term. I want to welcome in my co-host here, Mike Morgan from ESPN. Mike, what did you think? Your initial kind of thoughts from the second weekend of this glorious ride we call college football?
Well, it certainly was a lot more mellow in a way than week one was. However, there still were some moments and some signature games that really stood out. I thought Arkansas TCU we're in week two, and it's already going to be one of the best games of the year. If you were sitting down and you watched the second half of that game and the overtime, that's as good as it gets. It's really good stuff. It was a big win, too, for the SEC. I thought the Southeastern Conference had two wins to kind of hang their hat on after everybody just wanted to, kind of bang the drum that the SEC's down this year after a disappointing first week. You've got that one on the road at TCU, and then, of course, the one that was so hyped up because of the venue, Tennessee versus Virginia Tech. And, although Tennessee doesn't throw it all over the place, that's just not going to be their game. I don't think Dobbs is that kind of quarterback. They did play smash mouth when they needed to, got a little bit of help from Virginia Tech, but won convincingly. And again, Arkansas going on the road. I might have mentioned this last week, JC. Arkansas, to me, is that program in the Southeastern Conference that I really struggle to get a feel for. I have no idea how I feel. I liken it to, do you remember the show Mad About You, the sitcom that your girlfriend probably made you watch that, or your wife back in like the mid to late 90s. You didn't want to watch it, but you kind of had to watch it.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So think of 1997 Helen Hunt. And I look at Helen Hunt in 1997 like this. I could never really make out whether or not I found her attractive, and if I did, I didn't know to what extent. That's kind of how I feel about Arkansas. You understand?
That's classic.
I don't know if I find Arkansas attractive as a team. I don't know if they're going to compete in the West, and if they do, I don't know to what extent. So it was nice to see Brett Bielema, who to me is a guy that, even if you're not an Arkansas fan, you pull for. Mm-hmm. I think he's good for college football, and I think that he does things a little bit differently. They obviously did things incredibly different toward the end of that game. I mean, I don't know where he pulled that last play out, but that was phenomenal. It was just such a great game. So I was happy to see that for Arkansas, and again, the SEC picked up a couple of credible wins. The only other thing that really jumped off the page to me, JC, is, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, and that was the finish of the Central Michigan-Oklahoma State game. And I'll just tell you a quick story on that. I know a couple of college officials, and as I looked at my phone, I'm calling the Vanderbilt game, Vanderbilt Middle Tennessee, on the SEC network, calling it with the bat throw, which is a whole other story. But I see two text messages roll in about that game. I'm saying, why am I getting text messages from officials about that game? Like, were they that? I know they weren't working the game. Were they that entertained by it? And they both could not believe how the game ended. And one of them predicted, I mean, literally seconds after it was over, expect that officiating crew to be suspended immediately. And he was certainly right. It's been the talk of the town in college football. How do you have an 8-man crew and a 2-man officiating crew miss a rule? How, should you go back? I don't think you can change the outcome of the game. I know a lot of people think you should, even though it was a play that should have never happened. But when you see a play like that, last year it was Duke-Miami, when you see a play like that, I think even if your team's not involved, just as a college football fan, you're a little bit frustrated because you feel a natural sympathy towards the team that, for lack of a better term, got screwed.
Absolutely. And I think that when you look at it from that standpoint, something that, but you can't go back and overturn it.
Right.
If I were Oklahoma State, I would try to get it overturned. I would complain and just to see if somebody would bite. But the reason you can't is because it's a slippery slope. It's just like, the reason that you shouldn't, that you have to wait till all the facts come out when a crime is committed, because if you jump to conclusions, then all of a sudden other people are going to throw false accusations out there, and then you're going to have a lot of people convicted for stuff they didn't do. It's that kind of cry wolf thing, is that, if you set a precedent for overturning the result of a game because of bad officiating, then that opens an entire new can of worms, and then all of a sudden, some games are not going to be decided on the field. And it's not just going to be one incident. It's going to be a lot of incidents. And that's why you can't do that. It's for the integrity of the game and to avoid, Auburn one year when they think they got screwed on a bad call that cost them the game, from going and protesting the Iron Bowl against Alabama. And then all of a sudden, you could get lawyers involved. I mean, there's all kinds of – it's a Pandora's box when you go and do that.
It is. Well, the only thing I was going to say is I don't know in any other sport where you can do it. The closest thing you could come to it in Major League Baseball, I'm sure some fans would be familiar with the term, an opposing manager who feels like he just got jobbed can place a game under protest. And rarely does it happen. Even more rarely does anything get overturned. But that's the only sport where there's any kind of recourse like that. There is no recourse like that in football. It happens. We all know it's the wrong call. You feel bad for Oklahoma State. If I'm a pollster, which I'm not, I'm certainly taking that into account. If I'm dropping them now, I'm sure there's some people saying, "Well, wait a minute, should have never been that close." Or at home against Central Michigan, a team from the MAC, and there's some validity to that. But at the end of the day, they got jobbed, and it's unfortunate. I don't blame the replay crew as much, even though they're Big 12 guys, which really shouldn't be a factor. The fact of the matter is replay officials are sitting there. Replay officials aren't there to sit there and overturn an 8-man crew that doesn't know a rule. They're there to look at a replay and make a call on, was it at inbounds, out of bounds, was it a fumble, not a fumble. They're not there to page through the rule book in the middle of a game and say, did all 8 of these guys miss the rule? I mean, obviously you can do that. They can do that. But I think that's kind of unrealistic to happen. It really falls upon the referee in an 8-man crew. He's the final arm of the law. And unfortunately, and I don't know the referee's name, and even if I did, it's not my desire to throw fuel on the fire for him. We're all human. We're all fallible. He obviously made an egregious error, and it cost Oklahoma State a game. There's one other thing on that game I wanted to mention, JC. I'm driving in the car back from Nashville on Sunday, and I'm listening to a nationally syndicated show on a satellite station. I won't mention which one. And a former coach, rather prominent one, is saying, well, this is why you don't have a 3-man rush on a prevent defense toward the end, because this kind of thing happens. I don't know what game he was watching. Oklahoma State actually did the proper alignment. They rushed 5 guys. Look at the tape. 5 guys on the line, 6 guys back in coverage, and they still managed to give it up. So I don't think this is one where you second-guess the coaches on that last play. I second-guess the execution more than anything else.
Well, yeah, and Central Michigan, it was an unbelievable play because there was coverage on the receiver that caught the ball. I mean, the ball was kind of thrown short. He came back to the ball. He got it. The DB had him covered up. Then he laterals it to this other cat that's just there. I mean, that could have caught anybody off guard.
Yeah, when's the last time you saw a 45-yard hook and ladder?
I mean,
right?
That was just an unbelievable play. But, here's the thing. I mean, it does. It stings for, college football fans, at schools like Oklahoma State and even schools like Central Michigan to a much lesser extent. The fans are invested with these 12 games every year. There's only 12 of them that are guaranteed. And, there's 365 days out of the year. And the other 353, fans, hardcore fans, people that buy tickets, people that give money, people that go to Booster Club meetings, people that watch the Mike Gundy show, those guys are invested. And they get a lot of joy and gratification out of seeing their team win. And a lot of people, it ruins their whole weekend or their whole week or whatever. And so you feel for them, because, that was unfair, to them, unfair to the players and coaches as well. But,
right.
The fans are kind of the ones, because then now all of a sudden, you were about to pull a great escape, just like Georgia and Clemson and some other schools did this past weekend. But then you lose, and you have an ugly loss to Central Michigan on your resume when Oklahoma State is supposed to contend in the Big 12, which, by the way, and we'll go on and talk about this now, the Big 12 conference, not very strong so far this year.
It's a conference in trouble. I think we were projecting or speculating last week on what's going to be the conference left out of the college football playoff. That's always kind of a fun deal every year because 5 can't get into 4. Mm-hmm. So at least one of the Power 5 leagues is going to be left out of the equation. Well, a couple of years ago, the Big 12 kind of did it to himself by having 2 great teams, but you don't have a Big 12 championship game, which is going to be rectified, and they're desperately trying to expand, and we all know the deal on that. But in this particular case, the Oklahoma debacle in week 1, TCU obviously down, which I expected. You don't replace a Trevon Boykin. That kid meant everything to that team, not to mention Dotson, who's an NFL first-round pick at receiver, that you had to expect them to have a little bit of a dip. I like Oklahoma State. I like Mike Gundy. I did a couple of their games last year. Great fan base, as you mentioned, and they have a quarterback in Rudolph out of South Carolina, who I'm sure Gamecock fans wouldn't mind having under center the last couple of years. He got out of state.
That's a sore subject around South Carolina.
I'm sure it is. It should be, quite frankly. But that kid's a player, and they've got some weapons, but obviously they didn't do enough in this particular game, even with the bad call at the end. It shouldn't have been that close. And when I look at that conference overall, I'm not buying into Texas yet. That was a very emotional win over Notre Dame, but they've had some of those upset wins under Charlie before. Their problem's been consistency. So right now, if you would ask me a week ago, it would have been the Pac-12 left out. Right now, the Big 12 might be the leading candidate for that rather dubious distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I would have been with you with the Pac-12. Not that the Pac-12 is a bad league, because I think top to bottom, as far as depth goes, the Pac-12 is as good as a lot of leagues in the country. I think it's a very competitive league, and I think that's the problem, because when you look at the Pac-12 this year, there's no dominant team. I mean, we talked about Washington maybe being the front runner in that league or the best team in that league, but Washington is not that far superior to a USC or a UCLA or an Oregon or a Stanford especially, and even a team like a Cal or even Colorado, who's off to a pretty impressive start this year. Arizona State's dangerous. Arizona's dangerous. I mean, just about every team in that league, and I guarantee you Mike Leach, after his speech this past week, where he basically just said his team was just very, very soft and vowed to change it, they're off to a tough 0-2 start, but I think they'll upset somebody by the time the year's over. The Pac-12 just has a lot of balance and a lot of teams that are close together. So I think that was a valid point. But then you start to look at the Big 12 and you're like, well, who from, if Oklahoma goes down this weekend to Ohio State and Norman, they're out. Even if they win the league, they're out with those 2 non-conference losses. You don't know that Texas has the ability to run the table and finish with 1 loss or no losses. Okie State's already lost to a MAC team, even though we know that's probably not a game that you can count as a loss. It's still, that's going to be tough on their resume. TCU, as you mentioned, is down. You have to think that Baylor at some point is not going to be as good as they have been in the past. Even though they did play a good second half against SMU the other night, they were tied 6-6 at halftime. So I think that, you look at that league, and I make no bones about it. I am not a fan of the style of play in that league. I think that, Baylor and Art Briles changed the approach on offense. And instead of schools like Texas and Oklahoma and the other programs in that league looking at them and going, they're still Baylor, and we're going to do what we do, and we're going to counterbalance this by slowing their tempo down, by running, different tempos on offense. We're going to out-recruit them for the best athletes. and we're going to shut this thing down, which is what, folks did to Mike Leach in Texas Tech while he was there. He had some good years. He was never dominant. Instead of doing that, they all sort of started to adapt and change and become these high-scoring teams. And then West Virginia comes in the league, and they're going to throw it in the end zone, And so
right.
the whole style of play in that league, and part of it, too, is because of the high school football in the state of Texas. Texas is absolutely the Big 12's recruiting breadbasket. You're going to get – most of those rosters are filled with Texas kids with the exception of West Virginia. That's just how it goes in that league. And because there's a bunch of Texas schools. And so you look at it, and part of it's that because the high schools in Texas, about 15 years ago, started moving to these spread attacks and the shotgun quarterback and 5 wide and tempo and up and down the field. It's kind of a laboratory for these types of things. And so you do get players that are used to that. And so part of that makes sense. But I think that, the reason Texas and Oklahoma have been the best programs, historically in the Big 12, in the Southwest Conference or the Big 8, have been that they have the bigger, stronger lines and usually the better defenses. And that's been eroded over time as all of a sudden they woke up and instead of saying, okay, we're Texas and Oklahoma, let's do what we do. We'll make some tweaks, but let's do what we do. They started trying to be Baylor. And by the time they figured out that they wanted to go be Baylor, Baylor was 18 months ahead of them in recruiting because they were identifying guys early and getting guys and holding on to them and not letting them go other places and stuff. And so I think it's just it's kind of been one of those things where the style of play in that league, though fun to watch, and though there's a lot of great players and great athletes and all that talent, the style of play in that league has sort of taken it's equaled the playing field to a certain extent, and Oklahoma's not Oklahoma, and Texas is trying to get back to being Texas, but they hadn't been. So it's an interesting thing with regards to the dynamics in the Big 12, and I think this year it's going to rear its ugly head.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think it already has, and I think in the case of Art Briles, who, and I watched that interview on game day, man, that's powerful stuff, and I've been in meeting rooms with Art Briles, and I'll be honest with you, before I knew about all this, I was a huge Art Briles guy. I really was. He is personality-wise, he's a lot of fun to cover. I have tremendous respect. How could you not, with the job he did turning around a moribund program in Baylor that couldn't do anything right for decades, and he basically turn them into a national championship contender. That goes without saying. It's an amazing job. Unfortunately, sometimes you sell your soul to the devil in the process. And look, he's not the only guy to do it. We don't have enough time to talk about all the coaches who have turned the other cheek on any kind of sexual assault or any type of that kind of misconduct. It's quite frankly, it's the dirty little secret that has been around college and pro football for a while, and we don't hear about it as much. For some reason, if a basketball player does it or a baseball player does it, it is everybody knows about it, and it's front page news, but it just kind of gets buried under the rug in a sport that has 85 scholarship athletes, and it's a he said, she said, and if there's no video, it just seems to go on and on. But, Briles did it that way because he had to at Baylor. You're not going to win playing Smash Mouth in Waco. He had to do something different. Stoops came in and started running a lot of spread when he took over the job. And, for a while there, every Oklahoma quarterback's throwing for 3,000-4,000, and it's, they're just rocking and rolling. They win the national title, which now seems like forever ago. But as we talked about last week, I just wonder where Oklahoma's going. I just wonder where Oklahoma is going as a program, because they're still good. They're going to be consistently good, but I don't know if they're going to be great. And someone will say, well, they're in the playoff last year. They were. They got in the playoff, and they got blitzed. But I just don't see that program getting over the hump anytime soon. Whether or not that's a Stoops deal or not, I don't know. Maybe the Oklahoma job is harder than I think it is. But with all that tradition and all that facilities, and as you said, they certainly get their fair share of kids from Texas, it makes me wonder why they're not doing a little bit better than they are consistently. I'll double back on one thing real quick on the Pac-12 since you mentioned it. Southern Cal at Stanford 8 p.m. Saturday night. Stanford rolls in about a touchdown favorite. If they win that one, they keep getting McCaffrey going, and you look at the rest of that schedule, there's no reason why Stanford couldn't be at least a threat to run the table this year in the Pac-12.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you there. I think that when you look at the talent that they have, I watched their first game against Kansas State, and it wasn't that impressive, but K-State's a tough opener, and they're going to come in there and battle you, and it was 26-13 and kind of a sloppy type of game. But they're good on both lines of scrimmage, and we just talked about how the Big 12, teams sort of spread it out and throw it all over the place. Stanford's kind of a throwback, I mean, Stanford, the school that produced John Elway and some great passing attacks over the years, they run it with McCaffrey. They'll throw it selectively. They play defense. They play field position. David Shaw's probably one of the most, underrated coaches, I think, in the country, or at least talked about, doesn't get the credit he deserves. I think that you look at their schedule, what you mentioned. You have USC this weekend. You go at UCLA the following weekend. You go at Washington on a Friday night on September the 30th. Those three games, if they get through there, Washington State, then at Notre Dame, let's extend it out to the Notre Dame game on October 15th. If they can get through Notre Dame without a loss, I think that it's definitely conceivable that they run the table. I mean, but I think it starts this weekend with USC. USC wants to get up off the mat. They were embarrassed by Alabama. I mean, they're going to want to go up there and win. And that series sometimes, the underdog sometimes surprises the favorite with Stanford and USC. So that wouldn't be a surprise. But like I said earlier, the Pac-12 is a minefield, though, because even if they get through Notre Dame, they beat Colorado, they go to Arizona and win, they beat Oregon State at home, November 12th, they have to go to Eugene and play Oregon. Then they have to turn right around and go to Cal and play in the big game. And the Golden Bears are no pushover, I mean, so it's a rivalry game. So the Pac-12, I think, is definitely full of potholes for a team wanting to run the table. But certainly it starts this weekend. Yeah,
and even if Stanford goes 11-1, let's just say, I mean, here's what we think we know at this point, and we all know this can change. We think we know the SEC is going to have a team in the playoff. In fact, we think we know that for about the next 30 years, right? I mean, can you imagine a season where there's not a team from the SEC in the college football playoff? It's kind of hard to fathom. We think we know the ACC is going to have one this year. Mm-hmm. I mean, with Florida State and Clemson, and let's not forget about Louisville, who might have the leading Heisman Trophy candidate right now, quarterback. We feel pretty good about those two leagues. Then we just don't know. Then we really have to have a lot more data to input, whether it's the Big 12, the Pac-12, the Big 10. We don't know. We think Michigan or Ohio State would be a leading candidate, the winner of that ball game, but we're not positive. But we just don't know. Big 12, Pac-12, there's just so many question marks in those two conferences, and it's hard to really get a feel for either one of them top to bottom. I think we need at least another month before we really start putting kind of a grade on just how good the leagues are and how good the teams from those leagues really have a chance to compete in a playoff.
I agree with you. You mentioned the Big 12, and we'll go there quickly. Michigan 51-14 over UCF this past weekend, and UCF's improved under Scott Frost. It's his first year, but he made the mistake of saying in the post-game press conference that they out-tackled Michigan, and then, of course, Harbaugh responded to that. You just don't, it was just kind of one of those interesting things. UCF, I mean, to lose 51-14, yes, they were competitive, if you want to get right into it, but Michigan's blown out, Hawaii and UCF on back-to-back weekends. I mean, they've been about as impressive as you can be, although the competition's very, very not so good. And then Ohio State, I thought that, they kind of struggled early a little bit with Tulsa. It was a 6-3 game for a while. Then they came back and blew them out. Urban Meyer has a very, very good team. It's a very young team, and there are a lot of guys on there that are just now playing for the first time. Going to Norman, Oklahoma this Saturday, I think for them is going to be huge. I think if they can win it, they'll knock Oklahoma out of the playoff first and foremost. Secondly, I think that really gives them a lot of confidence to go through the Big Ten schedule and to win at the percentage that Urban Meyer has won during his time in Columbus. If they lose, maybe this isn't a team that's necessarily a playoff team, or maybe it's one that rallies like Urban Meyer's teams sometimes do and runs the table because it brings them together. Regardless, it's an of-note game. It's an important game. It's one I think we need to pay attention to this weekend.
Well, I agree. Look, those two programs are going to steal the spotlight all year long, with all due respect to Michigan State in that conference. It's just they are considered so far ahead right now. And a lot of that comes with the sexiness of Harbaugh and Meyer. I'm glad the Big Ten got that. I do think this much. I'd like to see a little more depth out of the Big Ten, but I do think at the top, at the upper third, let's just say, which, again, is how most people really judge conferences. We can talk about, the number 10 team in a conference beating the number 11 team in another conference. That doesn't register with fans, nor does it register in the way we really evaluate leagues. It's all about the top half or the top third or the top fourth. And in the case of the Big Ten, I do think the top has closed the gap with the SEC. And I'm sure that'll make our Big Ten brethren out there happy to hear that, because we're two guys located in the Southeast, and I'm one of them saying it anyway. But I do believe that, and I'm glad for it. Look, the SEC has been a league that I've covered my whole life, and I don't consider myself a homer, but I certainly do appreciate the conference, its history, and its overall prowess. But I don't think it's good for college football as a whole if that's the only conference that's winning national titles and just bombing the heck out of everybody every year. I'd like to see some more geographic representation. I'd like to see the Pac-12 get its act together. I'd like to see the Big 12 actually have 12 schools and a conference championship game. I mean, I hope we get to that point, because college football has never been better nationwide. And the good way to kind of help capitalize on that is to have good teams, not just in one region of the country, being the Southeast with the SEC and then the Clemson, the Florida State, and the ACC. We need some other schools out there that are true heavyweights, and I think Ohio State and Michigan are at that point, or are going to be in a very short time back at that point.
Yeah, I predicted that Michigan, when Harbaugh got the job, they would be in the college football playoff within 3 years. I think as is the case, a lot of times you get laughed off of Twitter about things. The Buckeye fans and the Notre Dame fans and the Michigan State people, you're crazy, Shurburtt. But I don't know.
I think it's looking good.
I still feel like I may be right. All it takes is
I would take that bet.
All he's got to do is beat the team at the end of the year, which is not going to be a spring picnic, because Ohio State's been doing pretty well in that series lately. But it's one of those things where he's got them in position, I think, already, and they're only going to get better. I think he's one of the best coaches in football, all levels of football. He's up there with the Pete Carrolls and the Bill Belichick's, and I believe the Nick Sabans of the world. Notre Dame plays Michigan State this weekend, Mike. I think that's kind of an elimination game for both teams, kind of like it is for Oklahoma against Ohio State. Big game for the Irish. Thought they bounced back pretty well against Nevada. DeShone Kizer, is a player that as a recruit, everybody was talking about Malik Zaire, who was already there, and everybody was talking about, other quarterbacks in that class. And Kaiser's a guy that didn't really camp. I mean, when you saw him at camp, he was 6'4", 6'5" guy, really strong arm, great kid, first-class kid. And really has a hot smoking girlfriend. If you look that up on Insta, go Google DeShone Kizer girlfriend. He's dating a
wow, that's intel.
Yeah, he's dating some hot blonde named Taylor. I forget her last name, but she used to date a basketball player, and now she's with DeShone. But just go look that up. So he's got that going for him too. But he wasn't a guy that in recruiting circles got the 5-star type hype that you see out there. But something told me when he committed Notre Dame, because he was going to go to LSU, and if you're LSU, you're sitting there going, why? Why, God, why? For not getting this kid. Because he would, unlike Brandon Harris, he would have fit that offense to a T, because he's kind of a pro-style guy. But what I liked about Kizer, and why I told Notre Dame people that I thought he would be special, there, not just good but special, is he was a rare type of quarterback to where he's a three-sport star, multi-sport athlete. And I think sometimes when we evaluate quarterbacks these days, we look at the camps, we look at things like Elite 11, which are great tools. We look at game film sometimes where they never get pass rushed and stuff like that. And we look at 7-on-7. And that's all well and good, but none of that stuff is like performing under pressure when the bullets are live. And I want the guy at quarterback that's going to step to the line with 2 seconds left in the state semifinal basketball game, in the semifinals of the state basketball tournament, and go up there and have to hit a 1-and-1 with his team down 61-60. And he goes up there and drills it. I want the guy that's going to strike out the side in the bottom of the ninth in the conference baseball tournament when he's brought in as a relief pitcher, that has that experience competing every single down. People ask me, we made a mistake. As good as the call was on Deshaun Kaiser, I made a mistake with Deshaun Watson. And what the lesson I learned there is I overvalued when I saw him at camps and didn't value enough what he had accomplished Friday night in and Friday night out at Gainesville High School in Georgia when the bullets were live. All-time leading passer in the state of Georgia history. That should have ended it. That should have been 5-star. It should have been done. But Deshaun wasn't a guy that, would blow you away at camps. He was a guy that would blow you away when you saw him in person, and that's football. And so I think that's what I liked about Kaiser, and I think you can see that these days. I mean, this kid's cool under pressure. He loves to compete. I just think he's a big-time player, and it'll only get better and better. But certainly it's going to be an important game for the Irish this weekend.
Well, and I like Notre Dame. I just think Michigan State, while I have the utmost respect for Mark D'Antonio, and they always have players, and they always are a well-coached team and play good football. I mean, they're one of the more consistent teams in college football when you look at what they've done the last 4 or 5 years. I just think without Connor Cook, they take a little bit of a step back this year.
Agreed.
And that to me is just, that's the overriding factor. If you gave me Connor Cook another year of eligibility, I might go the other way. But without that, and as you mentioned, with Notre Dame's quarterback situation in a much healthier state, I go with the Irish in this game.
Absolutely. Well, let's go around the SEC. There were some things. You talked about Arkansas, TCU. Certainly, I thought that was a highlight for the conference this past weekend. You had Vandy, Middle Tennessee, and it looked like where points were at a premium in Nashville the previous week. It looked like there was no problem scoring up there in just about any way you possibly could. And then I just get back to when I'm looking over kind of what happened in the league. I get back to Nicholls State in Georgia, and that's why I chuckled. I just and listen, I'll say this to Georgia fans: I would not be chuckling if Georgia had lost, because that's not funny. But it's just kind of funny that they went out and struggled against. I mean, what happened? Did they just not? They just thought, well, we beat North Carolina, we can sleepwalk through this one or whatever. That score baffled me. I mean, I was like, at the very least, how's this team going to stop Nick Chubb? Well, I mean, I guess Nick Chubb got no blocking during that game, so I thought that was just kind of one of those things. I don't think it's an alarm for Georgia. I think they're going to come back and play well, but man, how does that happen?
I wish I knew. It kind of goes under the same heading of how does Appalachian State play with Tennessee and go into overtime. A few years ago, when Will Muschamp was at Florida, I know they weren't a great team that year, but how do you lose at home in the swamp to Georgia Southern? I mean, these are things that just happen even to SEC schools. And in the case of Georgia, I think they figured, because I really thought that Coach Kirby Smart would wait till about week 3 or 4 before they said, okay, Eason's our guy. And now, if you've noticed, here we are, we're sitting at the beginning of the week, and they're still not sure who they're going to start. Jacob Eason, I think they figured, well, it's Nicholls State, so even if the kid's not ready, and even if he makes some mistakes, so what? It's Nicholls State. Well, you almost get beat doing that. And this is why coaches don't listen to fans. Yeah. Fans just say, go with the freshman. He'll learn on the fly. We can win anyway. Coaches like Kirby Smart know better. And that's why he didn't start a true freshman in week 1 against North Carolina. So it's so obvious. I feel like when I hear this, you got to put your Captain Obvious hat on. The quarterback's the most important position on the field. It's like saying pitching is important in baseball. Like, we all know that, right? But in today's day and age, unlike what it was 10, 20 years ago, it's so much more important because all these offenses now revolve around the quarterback spot. And if you get caught on a day where you don't get great quarterback play, you're going to lose. I mean, look how average, if not below average, Joshua Dobbs was in that App State game. That almost did him in, combined with not blocking well, combined with not tackling well. But you can get away with a lot of sins if you got a stud quarterback who plays like it. And this is going to be, to me, the storyline of the SEC all year long. And that is, there are so many teams. I've never seen a year like this in the Southeastern Conference where there are this many teams that have so many question marks at quarterback, whether it's LSU, whether it's South Carolina, whether it's Georgia figuring things out. Florida, for right now, it's Del Rio. We'll see how he does when the Tennessee game rolls up. How does he look against a Volunteers defense? You go out west and some of the other schools that have issues at quarterback. It's just, I've never seen it. And that's why I do think we're going to see more upsets this year in the SEC than we have in a while. Doesn't mean schools like Alabama are going to take a step back. But we already seen LSU take a step back. We've seen Tennessee get threatened. And I think we're going to see some other upset bugs come and bite some folks because unsteady quarterback play can just be a nightmare in college football.
Yeah, I'll talk about Tennessee for a little bit. That game, it was kind of a weird game. First of all, they showed the Jumbotron that they suspended over the racetrack, and somebody was up there, some production member or something. I'm not a big fan of heights. And so I was like, I got a little woozy watching that. Of course, I was flipping back and forth between that and Mississippi State, South Carolina. So maybe that was part of why I was woozy. I don't know. But it was a situation where I was like, whoa. But so it was just weird. The fans were way away. I mean, it was almost like the Hokies and Vols fans were sitting in the stands and they were watching behind a screen and I don't know, they were in it's like a cage match, like a gigantic
It's like watching a basketball game in a dome.
Yeah, it's just weird. Anyway, glad they did it. Glad for Bristol. Glad it happened and glad that we got the spectacle out of the way or whatever. But just the game itself, Virginia Tech, tons of momentum. They are going to be one of the better coached football teams in the country. Turnovers just killed them. On that stage that night, it looked like almost like the stage at times was too big for them. They do have a first-year starter at quarterback that came over from junior college. This was a big opportunity, and it was almost like when they got up, they were like, oh, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? On the flip side, I thought Josh Dobbs, even though he threw for 91 yards, which is not stellar, he threw for 91 yards, 3 touchdowns, did have 3 touchdown passes, and rushed for like 106 on the night. I thought he made some big plays when it mattered. And you talked about the quarterback being the most important position on the field. Your quarterback is not always going to have Big 12 type numbers, especially when you're playing against a quality opponent with a quality defense. What you want him to do is when it matters, he executes. When it matters, he makes big plays. When it matters, it's there. And to heck with the stats, you can pad those when you play a team that's not Appalachian State or Virginia Tech, And I think that what we saw was a quarterback that was really struggling, that maybe didn't put up the numbers that people expect from him in the passing department, but who came through with plays when it's mattered and led his team to a 3-touchdown victory. Now, Virginia Tech turned the ball over 5 times to Tennessee's 1, and you're not going to win like that against a quality opponent. But I still thought Josh Dobbs executed at the right time for the Vols.
He did, and that is his strength. I think his best strength is leadership, that he is the heartbeat of that team, which is why even if he does struggle, you don't even think twice about pulling the kid. I mean, he's going to be your guy. You're going to sink or swim with Dobbs. And there are times where he looks really good. He makes a lot of plays. And then there are times where he will make throws where you just scratch your head and say, what was he looking at? Or how is that the best spiral he can throw? look, he's not an NFL quarterback. I'll just come right out and say it. He's not that kind of guy. If you're expecting this kid to go out there and look like an NFL QB and make those kind of throws and those kind of reads, that's just not his strength. But you don't have to have an NFL quarterback to have a good college quarterback. You don't have to put insane numbers up on the board either to do it. They have so much around him that they can win games. I'm not going to say throwing for under 100 yards, but in the future, you can win games throwing for 250 or 200 if you're Tennessee. There's enough talent around him, and there's enough on that defense where they can do that, whereas a lot of schools, no question. I mean, for example, you take a Clemson with Deshaun Watson, and you look at what's been going on there, and that you have a couple of head-scratching games if you're Clemson. But when they turn it on, and I think they will, and when they get into the bigger games, they're not winning. In my estimation, Clemson's not winning. They're not beating Florida State, and they're not beating some of the other schools in that league if Deshaun Watson does not have over 300, 350 total yards. I just don't see it. That's not to say Clemson doesn't have other talent, but the way that they're designed, the way that offense is designed, and the way he is such the focal point, that has to happen. There are other teams like that where your quarterback has to put up a lot of numbers to come through. That's not Tennessee. I mean, that's just not the way they do it. They're going to win some games ugly. My guess is when that Florida game does come, if they win it, Joshua Dobbs is not going to have a pretty stat line, but they're going to have a couple hundred yards rushing. He's going to have a couple of TDs one way or another, and their defense is going to be salty, and that's the way they're going to do it, if they can actually get that monkey off their back. So everybody does it a different way, but he's certainly going to be the key, even if he's not putting up numbers in Knoxville.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that Florida game is going to be the biggest game of the Butch Jones era in Knoxville. It's huge. I mean,
it's beyond huge. I mean, I don't even know if you can overstate it.
No, I thought about not saying that, but then I was like, but it's true. I mean, it's just the honest to God truth. I mean, that's a huge game for them.
Look, you and I don't. I know a lot of people are still new to this podcast. Heck, we're new to this podcast, but you and I go back a ways. We're not into hyperbole just for the sake of hyperbole or being provocative. Just that's not us. But I honestly do believe if he loses that game, I sense there will be a snowball effect. I sense he won't survive. I just don't see it. I like Butch Jones. I liked him at Cincinnati, but I don't think another meltdown to Florida with this team against a Florida team that's we think they're good. We're not really sure. We don't know what the heck's going on over there.
Yeah, because Kentucky's awful, by the way.
Yeah,
Kentucky's not very good.
That's a whole – I don't know. I mean, look, we never expect a ton out of Kentucky, but I did expect them to be in better shape under Mark Stoops at this point. They're probably the worst team in the league, and I wouldn't have – I like the hire, and – I know Kentucky's a very difficult job. You know how difficult it is to recruit in that part of the country. You have to be kind of creative, and you have to find those 2-star guys that turn into 4-star guys and what have you. But I thought they would be better than they are, and instead they are staring 14th place out of 14 teams unless they figure something out in a hurry.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing on Tennessee, and then I'll actually address this Kentucky thing. Because I don't like I'm not going to just say they're awful and then drop the mic and roll, you know. Like, you're awful, bye, you know. What is this?
Good night, everybody.
What is this? By the way, Kentucky's awful. Good night. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. No, it's one more thing on Tennessee. The Florida game is huge, but Mike, think about this. Even they beat Florida, then you got to go to Georgia, then you got to go to Texas A&M, and then you got Alabama coming to Knoxville.
Yeah, it's a brutal stretch.
So this is we are about to see the defining stretch of the Butch Jones era at Tennessee, in my opinion. And thankfully for them, they beat Virginia Tech, because had they not, I think there would already be some kind of howling up there about his job and that situation. Not that would have been fair 2 games into the season, but I think that they've recruited well enough. They have enough players to where they should have a winner, and this year in the SEC East,
But I'm going to say something completely crazy, and this is kind of a drop-the-mic statement, but I will stay for the remainder of the podcast because I'm contractually obligated. I think of that 4-game stretch you alluded to, Florida, Georgia, A&M, Bama, 4 in a row, no bye week. He would be better served to lose 2 games in that quartet with one of the wins coming against Florida as opposed to going 3-1 and losing to Florida again. I think some people that might be new to are millennials out there listening that are new to the SEC. This was the rivalry in not just the SEC. It was one of the best in college football. I mean, every year, Spurrier's Gators, Fulmer's Volunteers, we were looking at 2 top 15, if not top 10 teams. We were looking at NFL talent all over the board. The winner was going to the SEC championship game, and back then, Bama was not Bama, LSU was not LSU. So when Tennessee and Florida went, they usually won, brought home the crown, and very often won a national title. In the case of Spurrier got one, and, of course, Fulmer got one. This game is still huge for that fan base. I know Alabama rivals it in terms of nastiness, but let's face it, nobody's going to give Tennessee a chance to beat Alabama, especially if they don't beat Florida. You've got to get an end of that streak. You completely squandered it. I mean, you had that game won, and you blew it. If you lose to Florida again to start that 4-game stretch, it's going to be a nightmare in Knoxville for Butch Jones.
Absolutely. I mean, they've lost to some Florida teams that weren't very good. They lost to Will Muschamp's 4-8 Florida team. That Will Muschamp was 4-0 against the Tennessee Volunteers when he was at Florida. Urban Meyer never lost. The last coach to lose to the Tennessee Volunteers at Florida was Ron Zook. And I think the Zooker went 2-1, and then Spurrier did lose his last. Ever since that final game in 2001 when they had to reschedule it for 9/11, it was Spurrier's last regular season game at Florida. Probably the most disappointing. I mean, I was just out of college and sort of just watching ball at the time, wasn't doing this. But I watched that game. I remember I was in Myrtle Beach. Actually, but my grandmother had passed away, and I was at the hotel waiting to go to something and catching that game. And I felt bad for Florida and for Steve Spurrier because they had probably the best team in college football that year. Lost in a monsoon at Auburn. Jabbar Gaffney, Lito Shepherd, Rex Grossman, lost in a monsoon at Auburn. And then here comes the Tennessee game. Tennessee's coming to the Swamp. The winner takes the SEC East. But, I still thought, well, Florida owns Tennessee, blah, blah, blah. Travis Stevens.
I think he's still running.
He ran for days down there. They just ran it straight up their gut. They won 34-32. Tennessee then blew the SEC championship game to LSU and Nick Saban. And that was kind of the start of the legend of Nick Saban that game because Rohan Davey, their starting quarterback, had gone out, and he puts in Matt Monk, and he leads them back to a 31-20 victory in that game. And so that was kind of a crossroads. That really, Mike, that little 2-week span in SEC football sort of set us on some different courses. That's
an excellent point. And this is what I love about what we do is that we can go back in time. You and I are not two old fuddy-duddies, but we are old enough to go back 15 years and remember it like it was yesterday because we followed this league for a long time. And I remember that game very well. And what's significant, kind of the most significant footnote, other than the one that you mentioned, which is kind of how the course has changed, is that is when the criticism of Steve Spurrier was at an all-time high. And I'm talking from Florida fans, because they had gotten so spoiled, and they thought it was their birthright to play in Atlanta for the SEC championship every year. How dare you lose a game at home in the Swamp, Tennessee, Steve Spurrier? And Steve finally, out of nowhere, I'll never forget where I was sitting there eating chicken wings for lunch at a sports bar, and I see on the crawl Steve Spurrier leaving the University of Florida job. And, of course, he eventually wound up with the Redskins. We all know how that worked out. But I'm convinced if Steve, let's say that team won a national title, if they beat Tennessee, if they go to Atlanta, if they beat LSU, I'm convinced Steve Spurrier does not jump for the money. I think what really motivated Steve more than anything else is he felt like he was starting to lose his luster a little bit in Gainesville, didn't feel as appreciated, and boom, much like he abruptly left South Carolina last year, Steve doesn't leave a trail of breadcrumbs letting you know what's going on in his mind. He just does it, and he did it and shocked everybody. Florida took a major step back with Ron Zook, but then Ron recruits so well that he sets the table for Urban Meyer to win 2 national titles. Yeah. So it's kind of funny how that whole thing worked out. But you're right. I mean, the impetus of the powers in the SEC really changed there for a while. And, of course, that's when Nick Saban started to become Nick Saban. And when Alabama hired him, obviously the SEC has never been the same since.
Yeah, and that also
was a trip down memory lane.
Yeah, that was
background music.
That time too was a nice window for Mark Richt at Georgia because with Florida kind of going through a transition. And then I think Tennessee had some teams during that time, like in 2001 they lost the championship game, and then Georgia won it for 2 straight years. Then in 2004 and 2007, Tennessee made it to the championship game, won the East, really with teams that weren't all that great, and gave Auburn that one year a pretty good game, and then gave the LSU national championship game in 2007 team in 2007 a pretty good game. So that was kind of a transition for the East as well. And yeah, Spurrier wrote about it in his book. Didn't come out and say, "Hey, the Gator fans weren't appreciating me," but said that he felt like he had been there long enough and just did it. One thing that year, though, that may have prevented them from winning the national championship, even if they had beaten Tennessee and beaten LSU, was that 2001 Miami team that won it was an unbelievable team. They beat the dog poo out of Nebraska. First of all, Nebraska didn't belong. No offense, they didn't belong in that title game that year. But they blew Nebraska out of the water, and I always thought it would have been neat for Miami and Florida, these old ancient rivals, because they go back even further than Florida and Florida State, to play in the Rose Bowl for the national championship. I always thought that would have been cool. But speaking of, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it would have been great if we actually had a playoff during all, because so many of those matchups that wound up being the national title game would have never have been the final 2 teams in a 14 playoff. It's so funny. The few people that were steadfast in thinking that the BCS was a great system, you can't find anybody on the planet now that would want to go back to that nonsense, that piece of garbage bestowed on the American public compared to an actual playoff. I don't know. There might be like 3 people left, and they're being checked for senility. So thankfully, we no longer have to sit there and debate and look at computers and what the Massey Index thinks of Tennessee's strength of schedule versus Southern Cal and so on and so forth. We're past all that.
Exactly. Decided by humans and a committee, and I think it's a good deal right now. It's very exciting. All right, so we mentioned Miami, the ACC. Miami plays an interesting, and just briefly want to kind of mention this game. They beat FAU, or yeah, it's F. I hope it wasn't. If it was FIU, I apologize, but I'm pretty sure it was Florida Atlantic. They beat this past week. They're 2-0. Now they get to go to Boone, North Carolina, and play a road game at Appalachian State.
I thought that was a typo when I saw it. I said, surely they're not actually playing in Boone. But they're playing in Boone.
Boone, North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, hey, Miami, it's pretty hot and humid right now down there in Coral Gables. So if you're a Hurricane fan, most of which don't attend their home games, you can take a nice trip in the mountains, get rid of some of that humidity and breathe some clean air and just get a little different atmosphere there. So that'd be a fun trip for the Hurricane fans that actually do travel.
Yeah, hang out in Banner Elk, North Carolina. Go to Boone Hall, get you a plate of biscuits. I don't know.
Hey, I'll give you a place. John Ritchie and I, former Oakland Raider, LA Raider, wherever the heck they were when he played, a longtime fullback in the NFL, now does some work for NFL Network. We did a playoff game there in Boone 4 or 5 years ago, and I still remember a steakhouse we ate somewhere in the mountains. Very nondescript, but if you're ever in Boone, the Fiddler one of the best steaks I ever ate. The Fiddler is what it's called in Boone, North Carolina. Check it out there, folks. Check it out if you're in App State land.
I am heading to the Fiddler next time I am in Boone. That's not too far from here, so that'll be good. So that's an interesting game. I think it's a game Miami can win. I think App State playing Tennessee close will get Miami's attention, and they'll go and take care of some business. I mean, I think it'll be competitive. And, they'll start 3-0 like people expected, then they kind of hit the gauntlet. The big game, though, and the one that's getting the hype on the worldwide leader and all over the TV and people are talking about is Florida State and Louisville. Lamar Jackson, a Floridian himself and part of kind of what's been a nice pipeline from the state of Florida to the Louisville program over the years. Just an amazing start. I mean, I don't know how good – I certainly don't think Charlotte has a very good defense that can contend with Louisville. And I know Syracuse isn't playing much defense this year.
Right.
But still 13 touchdowns in 2 games. I mean, that's sick. Those are PlayStation-like numbers. FSU, they've got some injuries. Derwin James is out, and he's a stud at safety. This could be an interesting ball game and one that I think will tell us a lot about both teams.
3 things come to mind about this matchup. Number one, if you're Louisville, do a better job scheduling. When you look at their overall schedule, it for a program that could be good enough to really have a heck of a year. I'd like to see a little bit more at a conference. I know they do have Houston late, and that'll be a marquee game. Charlotte gives you nothing, and Kentucky gives you nothing. Lamar's going to have a chance to run up some pretty incredible numbers this year with Louisville. Number 2, what Lamar Jackson has done against 2 atrocious teams and defenses is looked like if you're playing Tecmo Bowl back in the day and you had Bo Jackson with the Raiders, and if you can work the A and B button, nobody's going to stop you. It has been video game numbers, and he's looked like a video game player. But number 3, I can't help but think Bobby Petrino, who has left a trail of haters everywhere he's gone, and justifiably so. They still hate him where I'm based in Atlanta. They still hate him, obviously, in Arkansas where he was and really was doing amazing things. You kind of wonder if none of that would have happened, if he would have been able to conduct himself a little better, how Arkansas would have continued to flourish. But the guy can coach. I mean, the guy can flat out. You don't have to be we've learned this. You don't have to be a good person to be a great coach. And he is a great coach. And if he came to my house, I wouldn't invite him in for a cold beverage. But it was a shrewd move by Louisville to hire him when a lot of people still thought he was kind of the most vilified coach in college football. But they're going to reap the benefits because the guy he's going to scheme you on offense. They're going to score points. But my final thought is I think Florida State takes them down. I just think Dalvin Cook and that offense, I don't think Louisville will have an answer on defense for them. So even if Louisville lights it up and even if old Lamar puts up some more Heisman Trophy numbers, they're not going to stop Florida State from scoring at least 30, 35 in my estimation.
I think Florida State's got a lot of talent. The only thing that could possibly happen, and the good news is Ole Miss kind of runs a similar scheme. Dave Womack's scheme is not as exotic as Todd Grantham's at Louisville, but it is kind of one of those. They do a lot of 3 down, bring pressure from a lot of different, try to confuse you, that kind of thing. And as if the Louisville defense completely baffles DeAndre Francois and Florida State. But I think because Francois sort of developed, for lack of a better term, against Ole Miss and showed what he could do, and then they kind of had a snoozer last week against Charleston Southern, but that still worked. That's still a football game. He's going to be ready. And there are just times when living in Atlanta, you've seen a lot of Georgia football when Todd Grantham was there. That defense, when he was there would be games where they would get shredded. And then there would be games where teams had a hard time crossing the 50. That's just kind of the nature of what they do. And so there's always that, moonshot that all of a sudden Grantham's dialing them up and they don't know what to do and they're confused. And so the offense kind of sputters because Louisville does have talent on defense. I mean, I think, especially on the defensive front, But I'm with you. I mean, my pick is Florida State. I think that a lot would have to happen for Louisville to win that game, just because FSU. I mean, Louisville, yes, Lamar Jackson's a talented player. They are a good football team. They are a team that could end up playing in a playoff bowl, the Group of Five bowl or whatever. They could end in the ACC Atlantic because of Louisville, Clemson, and Florida State. It's a terrific division this year. But I just think FSU has too much. And I think that sometimes when, they're on the road, Jimbo Fisher's a very good coach as far as getting his teams to respond and making adjustments on offense especially, and going out there and getting his team to rally and win. So even if things don't go their way early, I still see Florida State pulling it out. Now, we mentioned Clemson, and this was a game against Troy this past weekend, Mike, that, I watched most of it. I thought that there were some bad calls that could have made it really dicey, bad calls against Troy. I think one of the plays where the Clemson guys going into the end zone, forward progress had not been stopped, was clearly a fumble. They blew it dead. Troy would have been running back the other way. Kind of just a sloppy performance by Clemson, probably not what we're used to. And Deshaun Watson, quite frankly, isn't playing at the level that he was playing at the end of last year.
And I don't know why. I don't have an answer. I think, in the first game, you say, well, maybe Auburn's defense is a little bit better than we gave it credit for coming in. So that I was surprised, but maybe I just second-guessed my thoughts on Auburn's defense. This game, I got nothing. I got nothing for you. When people talk about parity in college football, when you get past maybe the top 15, when you see some of those teams in the AP poll that are sitting there at 18, 19, 20, I'm not shocked anymore when they get beat by a Troy, because there's a big difference between being a legitimate top 5, top 3 national championship candidate like Clemson is, versus the teams that are just, in and out of the top 25, and one day they could be ranked 17th, and the next day they could be out of the poll, and then 3 weeks later they're not even one of the top 50 teams because we realized we had them misevaluated. Mm-hmm. There's no misevaluating Deshaun Watson. We know the kid is an incredible talent. We know Clemson has incredible weapons. So there's just no excuse to have a scare like that. This is not Georgia. Georgia has talent, but Georgia does not know what they're doing at quarterback yet. Clemson does. So this is one of those where you just kind of scratch your head and say, what the heck? Dabo Swinney doesn't strike me as a guy who has a problem motivating his team to play. So it's surprising. Now, how much do we read into it? Not a whole lot for me. I mean, I still think Clemson is a damn good football team and will be in the discussion for the college football playoff when it's all said and done. It's going to come down, obviously, to the Florida State game, but and the Clemson and the Louisville game, I should say. But I don't have any answers as to why a Clemson would struggle against Troy. I got nothing for you.
Sometimes in sports, and this is my theory on it, and I've just seen this, and I think about two teams when I think about what's happened with Clemson so far this year. Now they have South Carolina State this weekend. That's going to be, of course, I thought they'd blow out Troy last weekend, but I think they'll blow South Carolina State's doors off. Then they go to Atlanta to play Georgia Tech, which has been a house of horrors for them in that rivalry, in that series in Atlanta, when it's been played at Grant Field. So they go there the next Thursday night. So that's going to be the big test, for these guys. And I think they'll probably turn it around. But if you're looking for kind of the whys, I've seen this twice in two different sports. First is the 2014 Florida State Seminoles. They won it all in 2013. They come back. Jameis is back. Most of their players are back. They're the favorite to go again, and they struggled in just about every game. I mean, and they found a way to win, but they struggled in just about every game. Ended up winning the ACC, going to the playoff, and then got boat raced by Oregon in the Rose Bowl. In basketball, in the mid-'90s, Arkansas won the national championship. In 1994, they beat Duke in Charlotte, and that was their first national title. And so the next year, they have everybody back. I think Scotty Thurman was on that team. It was a Nolan Richardson team. And I think they ended
Corliss
Williamson. They ended up being about a 6 seed because they kind of slothed through the regular season. They didn't win the SEC, kind of got hot here and there. Well, they ended up running through the regional, going to the Final Four, got all the way to the Ed O'Bannon UCLA team that Jim Harrick coached and lost in the finals. And so those are examples of teams that have great years and that have everybody back, and then they just kind of don't rediscover the magic all the way. They're still very good teams, and I don't think that it necessarily, if you win every game close, you're still winning every game, and people are going to give you the benefit of the doubt and that kind of thing. But at some point, it comes back to bite you. And it came back to bite Arkansas in the championship game that year because UCLA was the better team, and it came back to bite Florida State against Oregon in the semis. And I think that that's the risk you run when you're Clemson and you're living dangerously, is eventually it's going to catch up with you. Clemson did not get to the national championship game last year by blowing out Miami 58-0 in the Orange Bowl. That didn't lay the groundwork for them to go and play and pull out close games. It was the closer games. It was the game against Notre Dame. It was the game at Louisville. Those types of challenges are what prepares you when you get on a championship stage. And even if you're good enough to get, a certain way down the road in a playoff, there are times that it will catch up with you, and eventually it's going to. And that's kind of how I see this Clemson thing unfolding. But it's only been 2 games. Who knows? They may turn it around, and we may be sitting here laughing about the Troy game at the end of the year.
Yeah, and they're gonna blast SC State on Saturday, and then they play on a Thursday night at Georgia Tech, and unless they're just so taken back by being cut blocked for 4 quarters by Paul Johnson's O-line, I don't see them losing that game. And then, of course, that sets up Louisville on October 1st. The only sneaky, scary game that no one's going to talk about on that schedule that I would just throw out there is November the 12th. They're at home, which is nice, certainly helps. They're playing Pitt. And Pitt is well coached now. Narduzzi was a long-time defensive coordinator under D'Antonio. They've got one of the best stories in college football, and Connor coming back from cancer and an injury. What they showed me against Penn State on offense impressed me. They got a little mojo going down there right now in Pitt. So I'm just saying that's just one game that everybody's obviously going to talk about the main 2. You're going to talk about Florida State. You're going to talk about Louisville. But Pitt's one of those, if you would have played the way you played the first 2 weeks, being Clemson, you lose that game to Pitt. Mm-hmm. Now they'll have a chance to get it all right before they see the Panthers in November. But I think that could be a game that's a little more interesting than people are talking about now.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll briefly mention it because we got a lot of fans out there that follow the school, South Carolina, Mississippi State, this past weekend. I'll just give you my quick thoughts because I've given them to a lot of people. But Gamecocks just simply were manhandled on both lines of scrimmage. I think that if they're going to have shortcomings in the offensive line this year, which they haven't played very well so far, that they have to go with a mobile quarterback to try to generate offense. And I think that points to Brandon McElwain being the guy against probably a dangerous East Carolina team this weekend and then moving forward.
Well, you saw more of it than I did, although I'm going to watch the tape on that because I've got Mississippi State at LSU on Saturday on Sports Radio USA network. Be looking forward to calling my first ever night game at Death Valley. I've called a couple of day games. Yeah.
That's going to be something.
That's been on my bucket list for a while, JC, and when I saw that on the schedule, I got pretty excited. And I do think, Mississippi State, the thing I didn't like about that game for Carolina fans is that Mississippi State, that they kind of teased you a little bit by laying an egg against South Alabama and say, oh, they must be terrible. But they're not terrible. They just played a terrible game in which they clearly didn't get their wake-up call. But then in week 2, an SEC opponent comes to town who's 1-0, and you're like, you're going to get your best effort there by the Bulldogs. Dan Mullen is not a guy that's going to let the thing spiral out of control because of one loss. He's been pretty consistent over there in Starkville. So From Mississippi State standpoint, I'm not surprised that they bounced back. From South Carolina standpoint, I remember a conversation you and I had years ago about recruiting. And this is back when Spurrier was the coach, and that they were obviously on a roll that set up those 3 11-win seasons when they got all those top kids in state that just happened to be NFL quality players, like a Lattimore, like a Jeffrey, like a Gilmore, et cetera, et cetera. But as you pointed out, that well was kind of drying up a bit in the state. Recruiting took a step backwards in the state. And while Clemson has been able to pull kids out from other states, the recruiting at South Carolina kind of started to slow down. And ultimately, that helped lead the way for Steve Spurrier's retirement. And ultimately, it led the way for whoever the new coach was going to be. He was walking into a situation where you had bottom third of the conference talent, and that's what you're seeing. I mean, when I watch South Carolina and what little sample size I've had this year, I see a school that clearly is behind the 8 ball in a lot of different positions where they're going to struggle to win more weeks than not. So you can talk about scheme, and we can talk about execution, and I'm sure over there in talk radio in the Palmetto State, every coordinator is getting ripped, and everybody's questioning which quarterback, and I think you bring up a good point about going with the mobile guy when you have a leaky offensive line. But I just, for me, it's the sum of the total parts right now in Columbia, and that is they don't have the kind of talent that they had a few years ago. This is going to be an uphill battle this year and maybe parts of next year. But I do think that Will Muschamp, from a recruiting standpoint, will get that program in a lot healthier state than it was the last few years under the head ball coach.
I agree with you there and that point. And they've got, they've kind of surpassed expectations in recruiting by getting McElwain in there. And then Jake Bentley's a better prospect than Brandon McElwain. So you've got 2 guys on campus already at that very important position. They feel good about their young wide receivers. They feel good about a lot of the guys that the Muschamp staff has brought in so far. It's just, he cobbled together one class, and then they're working on this next class, which is currently number 11 nationally, according to 24/7 Sports, and number 4 in the SEC. I don't know if it'll end up there, but it's a good start, and so they're getting some talent together. I think that more importantly, they're not going, the Spurrier staff, it was a situation where the guys, the in-state guys, the well did dry up. And it was a situation, though, that they weren't really willing or did not know how to go and compensate to where, maybe they don't have an Alshon Jeffrey on the roster or Marcus Lattimore, but they've got close. And they're going to remain in that kind of 7 to 8 win area, Then you plug them in and you go. When Spurrier lost a lot of assistant coaches after after 2010 and 2011, he hired some guys that just couldn't recruit and couldn't develop. And we found out later on the defensive side of the ball, couldn't coach at all. So
I was going to say a couple that couldn't coach either.
It was just a situation where that he just, I think, and if you look back at his days at Florida, besides Stoops, he never really had a staff full of guys. They were guys he trusted and liked, and they weren't superstar guys. A lot of them, Buddy Tevens, how did he do at Stanford? Carl Franks, how did he do at Duke? A lot of those guys didn't do so swift in other positions, but they were his guys. And at Florida in the 90s, when you're throwing the ball all over the yard and the swamp's rocking and you're winning a bunch of games, you're going to get at least, a third of the top guys in that state. Sure. That's going to give you a foundation to where, you go and you get a Rex Grossman out of Indiana, and then you go and you get Jesse Palmer out of Canada, and then away we go. That's and I think that when they started getting it going at South Carolina, and his coaches started leaving, and kind of his confidants, there was an assistant coach that left there after 2010 that was a guy that helped him hire a lot of guys. And he started listening to other people, and he just went out and hired whoever, because that's what he did at Florida. I'm just going to hire this guy because he's really good, and these guys. And then probably the biggest, paper tiger in the whole thing was that staff, because you had Clowney and because you had Lattimore and Connor Shaw especially, won 11 games 2 more years in a row. And so these guys who just kind of showed up and benefited from the fruits of someone else's labor, ended up, thinking, wow, I think they bought in that, wow, we're just, we won 11 games at South Carolina. We don't have to recruit, And then the bottom fell out. But anyway, the Gamecocks this weekend play East Carolina. I think East Carolina's got a new coach, Scotty Montgomery. He's off to a 2-0 start. East Carolina's beaten 6 ACC programs in a row. Hadn't beaten an SEC program in a while, I don't think, but certainly should be a good game in Columbia. Okay, time for random thoughts as we end our episode of the JC and Morgan podcast. I will let you go first because I have some good ones, and I want to sit here and make sure I've got my bearings before I roll them out.
Okay, well, I'll make I got 3 quick ones. One is a little bit off subject, which is why we call it random thoughts. I will be more comfortable when we get to a point watching a game I don't have to see a beer commercial where the start of the commercial is referring to flipping another man's meat. I know it's a grilling reference, but there's just something about that terminology. I don't know. I think I can live without hearing that at some point. I'm not sure exactly where that commercial's going or where it needs to go, but I can go without that in the future. Number 2, I am looking forward to calling the first game, night game for me at Death Valley. Really want to kind of embrace that whole environment, but I also want to see what the heck they're going to do at the quarterback spot in Baton Rouge. And number 3, and kind of a surreal experience in the game that I was called last week, Vanderbilt, Middle Tennessee on the SEC network. The analyst was Jordan Rogers, who's a former Vanderbilt quarterback, by the way, and yes, the brother of Aaron. He recently won The Bachelor. You watch that show, JC? Are you familiar with The Bachelor?
Yes, all the time. No, I know what it is, but I skip it.
I know you used to watch Kate Plus 8 now. Come on.
Oh, my gosh. Don't remind me of that, man.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to reveal that so early. Full disclosure, there was a time, when my significant other would have it on. I watched the show. I get it. I see the appeal of it. But I didn't see this past season. So we had a 1 hour and 45-minute lightning delay, which is always just a blast in an outdoor press box. And then Jordan invited who was the Bachelorette, JoJo, and she's precious. Couldn't have been sweeter and nicer, and obviously very attractive. And they're a great couple. But let me just say this. I don't think I've ever been hit up on so many Twitter notifications, retweets, when a picture came out of the 3 of us in the booth. And I think somebody tagged it, now you know what it's like to feel like the third wheel, obviously referring to me. And yes, I was definitely the third wheel in that picture. But then it started to get to a point where people that I knew and people on Twitter were asking me questions specifically about their relationship, because apparently that's a big storyline. Let me just say for the record, I have no idea about anybody's relationship. I don't know about who dated who, when, and what. I don't know what the status is. Not my place. All I know is it was a pleasure working with Jordan. He's a good guy who I think has a bright future. JoJo seems like a really sweet girl. I wish them the best. But if you're looking to me for TMZ-like insight on this relationship, I'm not your guy. Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to you now.
All right, I got 4 quick random thoughts. First and foremost, I'm looking forward to the premiere September 22nd of The Blacklist on NBC. James Spader does a fantastic job in that show. Here's my one concern. I hope that show does not jump the shark. So many of my shows that I like, I get into, I love them, and then they end up jumping the shark. So please, Blacklist, don't jump the shark. And I'll give an early please don't jump the shark to Vice Principals on HBO, which I also love, which is also hilarious. I look forward to that coming out. And then their season finale is coming out next week, I think. So that's nice. Awesome. Danny McBride is a very talented guy. Number two, read a great article today from Bleacher Report magazine where they interviewed Urban Meyer about mental health and sort of what he went through and all the stress and anxiety that he went through when he was the coach at Florida and how he got that straightened out. And it was real eye-opening and something that I kind of could relate to personally from a personal level in terms of just how we have to sometimes rein in our brain and, make it do what we need it to do and not what it wants to do. And we have to be aware of that. And really the one thing that Coach Meyer said in the article that I really appreciated and that I felt like was useful advice is the word awareness. He used the word awareness over and over again. And so I just encourage anybody out there that's kind of struggling with that, maybe being depressed, maybe not feeling so well, think about awareness and don't be afraid to go and get some help for it and to talk to somebody because, one of the worst things about struggling like that is that you feel all alone. And you're not alone. There's plenty of qualified, great people out there that will be glad to talk to you and help you get through that. And I'm saying that mostly to guys, too, because us guys, sometimes we're kind of like, well, I don't need that. I'm a strong man, and sometimes
Right.
it takes more strength to go out and get some help. So I encourage you to do that. Very inspirational article and kind of showed you, you dug into kind of what was behind all that and during that bizarre period where he left Florida and took a year off or whatever. Number 3, the Atlantic Coast Conference today announces that they're still kind of looking into what to do about their championships that are held in the state of North Carolina after the NCAA pulled it. I don't know that I have an opinion about whether the NCAA should punish states or not for their internal politics. I mean, they've done it before in the past to the state of South Carolina. And so on that note, I think that it clearly shows that there is, and I'm not saying that it happens all the time, but there is something to sort of a North Carolina, I don't want to say bias, but a preference within the Atlantic Coast Conference, because the baseball tournament was in Myrtle Beach a couple of years ago in South Carolina, and they were very quick to pull that because of the Confederate flag. But now that it affects North Carolina, we all have to kind of wait and see and all that. And I bet that the championship game, because there's really no other good place to put it, will remain in Charlotte this year. And I just kind of see that as something that sort of reinforces one of the most interesting things. And I've never bought into conference conspiracy theories ever. They love Alabama or they love, Illinois or whoever. But when you read the University of Maryland official Twitter account when they left the ACC and they sort of burnt the bridge down with it with no more Carolina bias, no more this, when an institution that's leaving takes a parting shot like that, and then you see kind of the abundance of caution to not tick anybody off at the Tar Heel State, when in the past they've just gone right after people in other states or events or whatever, it kind of seems a little wrong. And then my final point here. I am over Twitter. I love Twitter and tweeting and all that, but I am over every time somebody, not just me and yours truly, but everybody else out there that has an honest opinion about something, it's not met with nothing but snark and profanity and tough talk. We have Twitter. Well, the one thing Twitter's done for our world, beyond all the good that it's done, here's the bad thing. It's created a legion of keyboard cowboys and internet white knights who want to stand up for things that make absolutely no sense and that really aren't even based in any sort of substance. I mean, I notice people will argue with me. I could go out there and say, Alabama's a good football team. No, they're not. Blah, blah, blah. You're an idiot. Blah, 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 blah. I am over Twitter. I am over the snark. Give me a good old-fashioned message board melting down over the 140 characters of crap that I see out there every day, and I'm out with that.
Nicely done. Nicely done. And it's still at JC Shurburtt, right?
That's my Twitter account, buddy.
Okay.
I'll be monitoring it even though I'm over it. So
yes. Okay. Well, good. I'm at Morgan on air, and please continue to send all the hate JC's way, and send the nice bouquets to me if you can, since JC's already over Twitter anyway. But I'll leave you one postscript here before we sign off. Last chance I'm putting you on the spot. You got to get on that, my man. 6 episodes. The coach reminds me, he's kind of a mercurial dude, of a young JC, a young kind of energetic, little bit edgy, somewhat temperamental JC.
Wow.
Back before you kind of mellowed out into your empire that you've made for yourself since then. You will love it. It's 6 episodes of JUCO football at its worst and best in East Mississippi. I mean, I'm telling everybody out there, if you like college football, you will love that documentary on Netflix.
All right, I'm going to check that out. I know I should have last week, but vice principal's got in the way. So I
hear you.
I'm going to carve out some time. I'm going to kick Danny McBride to the side with Twitter and everything else, and I'm going to make sure that I see that. All right, be sure to check out the JC and Morgan podcast on iTunes. We are on Google Play. We're also on an app called Stitcher, which kind of funnels podcasts to you. You can download Stitcher on your iPhone and download our podcast and millions of others, or you can use your iPhone podcast app, or if you're on an Android, you can use Google Play and get the JC and Morgan podcast. You know, we're coming at you every week with hot takes from college football, the college sports world, and we appreciate you listening. So for Mike Morgan, this is JC Shurburtt. We're signing off, but we'll see you on the next episode of the JC and Morgan podcast.